As many, Chair recognize the honourable member for Bamboo Town.
Mr. Speaker, I arise today in this hallowed place, giving thanks to El Elyon, God Most High. Because indeed, Mr. Speaker, the psalmist says, to him be all glory, honor, and praise, because he alone is worthy. Yeah. And that is why I believe, Mr. Speaker, that Solomon said that to fear God and to keep his commandments is the whole duty of man. Yeah. Not the half, not some, but the whole duty of man, because God will bring into judgment every word and deed done in the body. Mr. Speaker, let me also thank the express will and heart of the people of Bamboo Town in having elected me to this place. And I thank God for that, Mr. Speaker, because you see, in a democracy, my belief is that the people are king. And the scriptures again say, Mr. Speaker, that the heart of the king is in the hand of God, and he turns it in which way he wills. That's right. And so, Mr. Speaker, again, in a democracy, the people are king. Some say the people are king for a day. That's on election day. But I believe, as the vast majority of political theorists, that the people are always sovereign. And that is why, during the swearing in into this Parliament, Mr. Speaker, I refuse to swear allegiance to Her Majesty the Queen, her heirs and successors. I affirm. And I did so, Mr. Speaker, because to me, in my own heart and mind, it was a lesser commitment. And I want all and sundry to know that at the first chance or opportunity I get to vote for a republic in this place, I will do so without hesitation. So I thank him, Mr. Speaker, for his express will being seen in the actions of the people of Bamboo Town, that I now occupy this chair in this Parliament. You know, Mr. Speaker, Sir Lyndon also agreed with that kind of thinking, because in conceding the 1992 general election, in conceding defeat, he said, and I quote, "The people of this great little democracy have spoken in a most dignified and eloquent manner, and the voice of the people is the voice of God." So again, Mr. Speaker, I believe that I am here as a result of his express will, and so is every other member of this place. In addition to, Mr. Speaker, I believe, as the member for Forks Hill says, that all of us in here are a representative sample of the views and values of the Bahamian people. So I have come to this place by the will of Providence, representing the views and values of the people of Bamboo Town. And I represent their views and values in this place, Mr. Speaker, with my voice and my vote. And just so there would be no misunderstanding, Mr. Speaker, during the very first budget debate in this place, I initially took that opportunity to speak to the themes that I would have spoken to on the campaign trail, just to reaffirm, reiterate to the people of Bamboo Town and this nation, to remind them of who it is that they had elected. Because the scripture says, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. So I spoke to them of the term I used on the campaign trail, the Bahamian dream. And to me, it meant how an individual can move from poverty to empowerment without structural and institutional obstacles. And that the only impediment to that particular individual's upward mobility should be that he or she is in competition with other Bahamians who are seeking the same goal. I spoke about my interpretation of the vision of our nation, which is that this nation should move with haste forward, upward, onward to food security, energy security, 21st century education in the area of STEM, of science, technology, engineering, and math, as was spoken to this morning by the member for Marathon, and economic empowerment of the Bahamian people, where we occupy the higher heights of this two-tiered economy, as was spoken to by Dr. Olivia Sanders. I recommended her book. I recommended a few other books. And I believe we ought to occupy that upper tier, Mr. Speaker, that we should own the tourism industry, majority owners, and that we should own the banking industry, Mr. Speaker, of which Bahamian banks now have about 20%. 80% of the market is mainly for the Canadian banks. Yeah. And so, Mr. Speaker, I took that opportunity to remind folks of who I am. Also in that first budget debate, Mr. Speaker, I spoke about promises I personally had made to the constituents of Bamboo Town to fix roads and parks and to help develop the physical infrastructure of Bamboo Town and to assist them personally. And speaking about that, Mr. Speaker, while I was in this place about 2 Wednesdays ago, my wife WhatsApped me and said that there was a gentleman on radio who asked the question, has anyone seen the Member of Parliament for Bamboo Town? Has anyone seen him or heard him? And you know, typically, Mr. Speaker, when those folks out there who support me tell me what someone would have said on the radio and I hadn't heard it, you know, I usually want to go back and check just to be sure. But you know, this is the wife, so any man who is married would tell you, you don't go back and question that which the wife has said. So I accepted it.
You're a smart man.
I take that. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to answer that gentleman this way. He ought to go ask the residents of Airedale who have had the entire subdivision road paved and the Airedale Park, the dilapidated fencing removed, and the park itself now is in the process of being renovated. He ought to ask them. He ought to ask the residents of Munnings Drive between St. Vincent Road and Blue Hill Road. Yeah. They've had that road paved. Yeah. He ought to go ask them. Mr. Speaker, he ought to ask the residents of Malcolm Road between Kennedy Subdivision Road and East Street who've had their road paved. He ought to go ask them. Mr. Speaker, he ought to ask those of Bishop Way, of Cox Way, of Cowpen Road, who have had their road paved, Mr. Speaker. He ought to ask them. Mr. Speaker, he ought to ask the residents behind Smith's Motel, a dirt road that has been there for almost 30 years. I met it, and I told the residents I will attempt to pave it for them. And Mr. Speaker, they have had half of that road paved where the majority of residents live. He ought to ask them.
Yeah, that's it, boy.
Mr. Speaker, he ought to ask the residents of Crystal Bay who have their road paved. And he ought to ask all the residents who traverse East Street between Malcolm Road and Sapodilla Road, that bad stretch of road, paved. He ought to ask them.
Give him a bit now, just now. Don't take all.
Put some more in this out.
Mr. Speaker, he ought to ask those persons who lived in certain flood zones where I put down disposal wells in Domingo Heights, in the front of Sammy's Chicken, in Kennedy.
No, you won't do all of that.
Okay, Mr. Speaker? And we're in the process behind Super Value where there's a major flooding problem, Mr. Speaker, we're putting a disposal well there in the next week. That's going to be solved. Because we found a cavity under there, under which we will dump that water.
That's right.
Mr. Speaker, you ought to ask them. And Mr. Speaker, I take this opportunity at this stage to speak about
Don't let them
drilling
bring you
disposal wells, because we have a major problem in this country with metals. And every time I drill a well and we put a grill on it, thieves come and take the top of it. And they don't understand that when they do that, they allow all of the sediments to rush back into the well and all of the refuse. And it reclogs the well. So in 5 to 6 months, you have to go back and re-drill it again. We need to do something about that.
Thieving.
You've done better.
Not stealing.
You've done better than Tennyson Wells.
Mr. Speaker, I want to remind that gentleman who wants to get in this place that he ought to go ask
Short, bright one.
the people of Coxway and Florida Court,
Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, of Forbes Court.
Oh, God, yes. That's our God, yes.
Because in my walk through that constituency during the campaign and subsequently thereafter, the residents said to me, Mr. Wells, in the middle of the day, the electricity goes off. And it stays off for an hour or two. I said, is this something every day? The woman said, every day. So I inquired the member of Tall Pines, spoke to him about it. And he said, yes, there is a problem. We have a trip fault. There's a line problem going to Blue Hills. And so that's what happens. So I called some of my engineering friends in BEC, and I said, man, you all are engineers. You all are problem solvers. This should be a simple problem to fix. Fix it. And Mr. Speaker, with Tall Pines and their help, they fixed it.
Yes.
And so now the residents of Forbes Court and Coxway are all aglow, literally.
Oh, you didn't bring your seat again. Yes.
Mr. Speaker, I
So when short man saying anything, don't listen to him.
want to remind him
Brian Collins, what you did on.
of another incident, Mr. Speaker.
You got 4 lost.
In October of 2013, I received a call from an elderly resident who lives in the area of Jones Heights. Jones Heights is an area where Jones Drive, off of Sapodilla Boulevard, Bamboo Boulevard, and Willow Tree Avenue. I believe the member for Golden Isle's mother lives in that area.
Yes.
And Mr. Speaker, the lady called me and said, Mr. Wells, for 25 years or so I've lived in this area, and we've not had access to potable water. And so I said, well, when I walked through that constituency, through that area, which is an area of about 250 homes, about 70% of that subdivision is actually Pinewood. It belongs to the member for Pinewood. So about 30 to 40% is mine. I said, well, when I walked, no one complained. And she said, well, you know, Mr. Wells, in all honesty, me nor my neighbors thought you was going. So we didn't think to inform you of such a thing. And so, Mr. Speaker, perhaps that's why I lost that polling division by 132 votes. It might also be that, you know, they put the uniform branch vote in there and the civil servants from the early vote. But you know, Mr. Speaker, I won Bamboo Town by 280 votes, so I made it up elsewhere.
Yeah.
But, Mr. Speaker, I got off the phone with the elderly lady. I told her I will seek to address the issue. And so I called the chairman for Water and Sewage, Mr. Glenn Lavelle, who's another engineer, brilliant engineer. I said to him, Glenn, I've been informed of this issue going on in this area. And he says, yes, there is that issue. He says the problem has been around for donkey's years. He said we have a scope of works. We keep updating the scope. He said every government that comes along tells us to pull it, we put numbers to it, and then they shelve it. I said, well then, let you and I skillfully get this done. And so in the next meeting we had with the Deputy Prime Minister, I brought it up. We discussed it. And Glenn and I, the Deputy Prime Minister, and The permanent secretary took it to the cabinet of the Bahamas, and the cabinet approved it. $4.25 million to put in portable water into that area. And that program, Mr. Speaker, that program was launched about 2 months ago in the yard of South Beach Police Station, and scores of residents turned up to sign up for portable water. And I want the others in the Jones Heights area who may not be aware of it, that now they have access to portable water. They can come off of their well water if they so choose.
Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, I've also assisted residents in Bamboo Town through College Ready, Bahamas, and I've helped them, I've helped scores of young persons to get into college through that program. Mr. Speaker, I've also assisted residents in finding jobs.
Tell
Not in the government sector.
Tell them tune into that.
Since having been elected, I can say I've only gotten one person, one job in government. But I've gotten others jobs in the private sector.
That's right.
Through my constituency. He ought to go ask them.
Talking man.
Mr. Speaker, I also promised the residents of Bamboo Town, I promised them this, that I would have created the largest park in the southern part of the island.
Unless it's over 3 acres, don't say.
And now, Mr. Speaker,
That's what I.
we are well on our way. It's over 3 acres. We are well on our way. All you have to do is turn off of East Street onto Sapodilla Boulevard and just slightly look up. The land is being cleared. The park is in process. I want to thank the Minister of National Security and the Minister of Works who have assisted me in putting some fill in there. And so, Mr. Speaker, you ought to know that that is coming. In addition, Mr. Speaker, right next to the park, we are opening our Center for Excellence. I just signed the lease for the building, and in this building I am moving my after-school program. My after-school program where I teach children, young men and women, in school, the value of an education in STEM, in science, technology, engineering, and math, helping them to understand that mathematics is not difficult. It is the way it is taught. We're teaching them from chalk dust, pattern-based mathematics, right start mathematics, developmental mathematics, Mr. Speaker. And in addition to that, Mr. Speaker, I am also going to be offering a course that's going to be taught by one of the foremost draftsmen in this country, teaching men in my constituency, giving them marketable skills as to how it is they can do AutoCAD drawings, because it is one of those areas, Mr. Speaker, that is sorely needing of persons in the industry in this country. So we're going to be doing that. And in addition, Mr. Speaker, every Saturday, at the end of July, once we have finished the renovations we've begun in this Center for Excellence, Mr. Speaker, we're going to be teaching the young men and women in the constituency of Bamboo Town how to repair electronic circuit boards, how to repair a capacitor, a transistor, an inductor, a resistor. There is no modern equipment today that does not have an electronic component to it. So we're going to give them that marketable skills, and that course is going to be taught by one of the foremost repairmen in this country. So it's coming. And last but not least, Mr. Speaker, I want to speak about the Fab Lab that's attached to my Center for Excellence. Fabrication labs, Mr. Speaker, of which there are about 200 around the globe, are connected to the University of MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston. It is the foremost engineering school on the planet. And Massachusetts Institute of Technology School for Bits and Bytes. The dean of the school, Mr. Geisler, I have spoken to him personally. They are willing and will assist in us setting up this fabrication laboratory. And what is a fabrication laboratory? The area for materials and design has now moved into 3D printing, where you actually can take a block, a piece of equipment, and create a component part in a lab. using the correct kind of tool and cutting it to form and to fit any kind of piece of machine. And even in the medical industry, Mr. Speaker, they're using 3D printing to make body parts, prosthetic limbs. So that's going to be happening, Mr. Speaker. And I'm going to be doing that because I believe in science and technology. I believe in expanding the built environment. And so I appreciate the increase in the constituency allowance. I was a part of the subcommittee for that, Mr. Speaker, and I'm happy that we've increased it. I would also like to have seen the government give us more money than just the $50,000. Oh, it's 100. Well, actually, I've been wanted more than 100 as well, but I'll take that. You know, I had made the suggestion to the Minister for National Security, and he could confirm inside the smoker's room. I said, man, you give me $1 million. And he says, well, what's the policy rationale for that? I said, well, you're already giving me 50. Give me $1 million. And let me tell you something, Mr. Speaker. What I've done in the constituency of Bamboo Town already, I will transform that constituency, Mr. Speaker. And as Bruno Mars says, if you don't believe me, just watch. Mr. Speaker, so I thank you. I thank the government for that increase, because you were the one that mentioned it in this place. Now, Mr. Speaker, speaking about developing skills in the built environment. Mr. Speaker, I employed the government of the Bahamas to bring, without haste to this Parliament, the Contractors Bill. And why do I say you should bring the Contractors Bill? Because, Mr. Speaker, the Contractors Bill is the last plank. It is the last part of closing the circle of licensing the entire built environment in this country. Mr. Speaker, the road to licensing the construction industry in this country started immediately after independence. And the first group to have received their license was the architects in the 1990s. I was the individual, Mr. Speaker, in 2003 and 2004 who led the charge for the licensing of the engineers in the Bahamas, Mr. Speaker. And during the last PLP administration, under Minister Bradley Roberts, I held sit-outs and sick-outs to see to it that that got done. It came to this Parliament and it was passed. So now the architects are licensed, the engineers are licensed. The next group of persons who must be licensed, Mr. Speaker, is the contractors. And I believe and know that if we license the industry, the BAMSI insurance debacle would not have happened, because it would have been a part of the requirement of every licensed contractor to have his or her own insurance, as it is for every architect, as it is for every engineer. Mr. Speaker, there are portions of the built environment of the contracting industry that is licensed. The plumbers have the journeyman license and they have the master plumbers. And we in the industry know when to give it to the journeyman and when to give it to the master. Mr. Speaker, the electrical industry is licensed. You have single-phase and three-phase electricians, Mr. Speaker. And we in the industry know when to give it to the single-phase fella and when to give it to the three-phase fella. The other parts of the industry that is not licensed is the air conditioning contractors, the mold remediating contractors, fire protection, Mr. Speaker, and the builders' works persons. Those who actually build the physical structure. And so, Mr. Speaker, I believe that once we would have licensed these contractors and established a local contracting board, that is a panacea for a lot of what ails us in this country. We have, in the Ministry of Works, some $111 million we're talking about capital works. And I think to ensure that we get value for money, moving forward, that we ought to know who's capable of doing the job and doing it well. And Mr. Speaker, if we were to do that, I believe that it will get rid of one of the other problems that we have in this country, or at least I wouldn't say it's a problem, but you know, the member for Long Island mentioned this thing about friends, family, and lovers. And she used it in a way to say that contracts are being given out to such persons. But you know, Mr. Speaker, if we were to license the industry, that kind of argument in and of itself goes away. Because at least the friends and families who receive these contracts, they themselves would have qualified themselves and had the requisite skills to do what it is that they are being contracted to do. I believe also, Mr. Speaker, that this would be a panacea for another thing that ails us. The member for Pinewood spoke about how during the 1980s, Balfour Beatty brought in foreign workers. Bahama brought in foreign workers, Mexicans. And now, Atlantis brought in foreign workers, Mexicans. Bahama brought in foreign workers, Chinese. You see, with the establishment of a contractors board, every construction company that seeks to come in would have to get approval from them and would have to be connected to them. So now we would have economically empowered and politically empowered an entire industry, Mr. Speaker. And they would be able to say, you want a guy who could do sheetrock in a hotel? Here's 10 contractors who have that requisite skills. Hire them. So I look forward to that coming, Mr. Speaker, to this Parliament, so that we can vote for it and empower the Bahamian people in that way. Mr. Speaker, I also look forward to the return to this Parliament of a pension bill. About 2 years ago, Mr. Speaker, the pension bill was brought to this Parliament. It went to second reading. We started having a debate. And Mr. Speaker, I fundamentally disagreed with that bill and said so in here. I said so in here and outside of here. I asked my colleagues some questions. They didn't give me the requisite answers. And at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, I came in here and fundamentally said what my issues were with it. And I'm not going to go through every one of them. But I'm going to say this, Mr. Speaker. I believe that pensions should be contributory on both the employer and the employee part. And in addition to that, Mr. Speaker, the pension should follow the employee wherever he or she goes, like the 401k in the United States. And you know, Mr. Speaker, a large part of our debt, though it is not direct, counted as direct debt, is the pension liability on the government. I think the Minister for State has said that government was initiating a study to see how we deal with that. But Mr. Speaker, I am always interested in the way others would have solved problems. And I believe that one of the good models that we can look at is that of Singapore. Singapore has one deduction that they take from their employees in Singapore. One. And it goes to a fund where Singapore uses that money to give its citizens three things. One, that's their NIB contribution. So they have their Social Security. Two, that is a part of their pension contribution and their pension fund. And three, they use it for NIB, for national health insurance. So out of that one payment, all three of those things are given to the people of Singapore. As a matter of fact, the people of Singapore, the government of Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew, began to establish their national health insurance scheme by simply, because initially the fund was only for pension and NIB. And what he said was, listen, we will take 1% of that contribution now. We won't increase it, but we will take 1% of that which you are already paying. And we will register all of the citizens in the national health insurance scheme. And then he said, over 15 years, we will phase it in, because we're going to need to take about 15% of your income. Actually, it was 16% of their income. And every year, it was a 1% increase. And so, Mr. Speaker, I believe that we ought to bring back that pension bill. And I look forward to it coming. And us bringing the requisite resolution in that area. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me move on to something that's a little bit more contentious. Because there's a lot of noise out there in the blogosphere. My home phone and my cell phone hasn't been able to rest since Monday last. I've had calls from reporters, from politicians, from constituents. Constant. And it didn't help that I was a little under the weather last week.
I told him you feel for life. I told him that.
Mr. Speaker, so I'm going to Mr. Speaker, so I'm going to take this opportunity and the remainder of my time to address the issue that came up in this place on Monday. When the member for Marco City resigned as a member of the Progressive Liberal Party. And, you know, I want to say in the words of the street, I don't want nobody in here start feeling some kind of way or catching feelings. I want to say that at the outset.
Nothing like going on here now.
I want to say, Mr. Speaker, and I want to make it crystal clear. Just so that there's no misunderstanding to all and sundry.
Yes.
I,
Yes.
Renward Ricardo Wells,
Yes.
fully support.
Yes.
Say it again. I fully support.
Say it loud and clear.
I fully support the actions of the Member of Parliament for Marco City. In that, he is following his conscience and his conviction. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, that all of us in here
It's set me up, man.
Listen, boy, go do that, boy. Go ahead.
I believe, Mr. Speaker, that all of us in here,
You got to start again, man.
should support
It's set me up, man.
Listen, boy, go do that, boy. Go ahead.
I believe, Mr. Speaker, that all of us in here,
You got to start again, man.
should support that kind of action on the part of any member, if he feels and he says that he's following his conscience and his conviction. Because, Mr. Speaker, to me, it speaks of the maturing of a democracy. And, Mr. Speaker, let me say this. I want to relate a story. I want to relate a story. Or rather, Mr. Speaker, an interview that was done by the Right Honourable Member for Centerville. Mr. Speaker, it was an interview for a documentary about the life of Sir Lyndon called On the Wings of Men, done by Calvin Harris, who lives in the United States, and is the twin brother of Minister K, Calvin Harris, one of the well-known radio personalities. In that interview, Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Prime Minister said that while he and the then Prime Minister Hubert Alexander Ingram stood over the deathbed of Sir Lyndon as he transitioned from this world to the next, that the then Prime Minister Hubert Alexander Ingram said to Sir Lyndon, "I forgive you for all the things you did to me. And I want you to forgive me for all the things I did to you." And there was not a dry eye in the room. It's the other way around. They say it's the other way around.
I don't put Sanville through that today, man.
But Mr. Ingram, but Mr. Speaker, I think that kind of tit for tat and butter for fat,
Read my dog, I kill your cat.
Mr. Speaker, that kind of wielding of political power to damage or destroy one's adversaries, that moment, that scene, Mr. Speaker, should never again play itself out in the annals of Bahamian history. It should not. For, Mr. Speaker, it speaks to a democracy in transition to maturity. Mr. Speaker, I am often accused of colluding in this place with Bamboo Town. I am often accused of colluding in this place. Bamboo Town, Fort Charlotte, and Marco City. But, Mr. Speaker, it is not a matter, and I want this on the record. It is not a matter, Mr. Speaker, of a collusion, but rather, Mr. Speaker, on points of public policy, it is a matter of convergence, of conscience and convictions on critical issues. Mr. Speaker, and even in that, we express that conviction and conscience in different ways. You know, the member for Fox Hill is famed for saying in this place that we ought to let 1,000 ideas compete. In politics, Mr. Speaker, in a mature democracy, the battle is not fought on a personal level where we seek to injure anyone financially or personally, but it's fought on the high plane of ideas. Let those ideas compete. And, Mr. Speaker, that is why in this place, Bamboo Town and Fort Charlotte, we spoke about bringing a member's bill to this House for debate. And, Mr. Speaker, you would be surprised as to the reaction by some. You all think you all better debate it than others. Why you all want to bring this? They forget that fundamentally, Fort Charlotte and myself, that is something we preached when we were outside this place. And I believe the persons who had an issue with that, they forget that the Right Honourable Member for Centerville in 2002, in order to become the Prime Minister for the first time, I don't know whether the then Minister of National Security were a part of that debate, but he debated Tommy Turnquest. It was on the record. They forget, Mr. Speaker, that in 2009, it was Fort Charlotte and myself that went around on the radio talk show in this country saying there should be a debate in the Elizabeth by-election. We said it. We went to Jones Communication, and Mr. Jones said, you know what, I'll do it. I'll put it on.
It was done.
And it was done. And the Bahamian people was the better for it. Now, some may say that ain't the case, because some say that was the emergence of Fort Charlotte.
Well,
But the Bahamian people were able to see and to say, we like that. And, Mr. Speaker, I just saw about a month and a half ago, you know, we love the British. I saw 6 persons stand up on a stage in the UK and said to the people of Great Britain why, Great Britain and Northern Ireland, why they should be Prime Minister. There was a debate, more than one.
Yes.
And, Mr. Speaker, the Bahamian people then, the British people then said, we want this fella. And we saw the emergence of the Scottish National Party, where one particular party, the Labour Party, now has been decimated in a sense. But the people were able to see. Who would have thought Barack Obama would ever have done what he did? But it was because of that mature democracy, where a fellow who even in a 2-term senator first gave a speech in 2004, stands up in front of the American people and say, y'all should have me as president. Not her, because they say it's her turn. And the American people say, we like you. We can take you. Now, I have some problems with some of his policies. especially his foreign policy, but I ain't talking about that in here. And
Yes.
so, Mr. Speaker, there were those who had issues. But, Mr. Speaker, all of a sudden, those issues have gone away. The Right Honourable Member for Centreville challenged the leader of the opposition to a debate. All of a sudden now, it's right. But I ask the question, is it right because of who said it and when they said it, or is it intrinsically right?
You got me in suspense now.
Mr. Speaker, again, I am often accused, don't be in suspense. No one has to believe that the sky is going to fall out today.
Okay, please, yeah.
Let me say that.
Okay. I feel better there.
Okay?
This guy, he wasn't going to fall no way.
Mr. Speaker, I said that we are often accused of colluding together in this place, eh? The three of us.
Not today. All right.
He might fall out some
But it is more a convergence of conviction
other time.
and conscience. Mr. Speaker, on the issue of VAT, the member for Marco City said, I will not support VAT. I vote for it. He said, I believe in an income tax on the wealthy or the upper income earners in this country. And you know, Mr. Speaker, I fundamentally believe that too. And if I had the choice between VAT and that, I would have voted for it, for the income tax. But I supported VAT, as did the member for Port Charlotte. But we supported VAT with caveats, different caveats. The member for Port Charlotte said, I'm voting for no new tax in this parliament in this term, after this.
I need to be at 3 o'clock.
I then said, I am voting for this VAT because my party has promised a substantial reduction in the cost of electricity. And I believe that if you lower the cost of electricity, that the net economic effect is zero. Because most Bahamians pay, on average, about a $300 electricity bill. And when we came to power, it was 42 cents per kilowatt. If we then lowered that down into the 20s, that's almost $150 they now have in their pockets. So if you take it out in VAT and other places, the net effect on the Bahamian people is zeroed. So I aggressively supported energy reform, and I spoke to it in this parliament. I've spoken to it outside this parliament. And let me say this, Mr. Speaker. I'm not going to talk about it too much in here. But the fact of the matter is this. I believe that this country needs to move to LNG and gas yesterday. Now, there are those who talk about bunkersy and it being cheap. And they're right. It's comparable with LNG. But any engineer will tell you the heat rate of bunkersy and LNG, there's no comparison. The environmental effect of bunkersy and LNG, there's no comparison. The amount of bunkersy and LNG need to run an engine, there's no comparison. And Mr. Speaker, in addition to moving to gas, we need to bring in aeroderivative engines, jet engines, that we would be able to run off of diesel, off of LNG, off of LPG gas. Nothing is cheaper than LPG gas, the same gas we use to cook with. And if we do that, Mr. Speaker, we have now a cogen system. We take a steam engine and stick it on that jet engine. And so now 2 turbines is producing electricity. And from that steam engine, we now have water that we could send out, portable water. So, Mr. Speaker, I am going to be watching very keenly the work of Power Secure. Their specialty is supposed to be T&D, and so I can see whether they come with the ideas of a smart grid. I can see whether they want to put in grid storage devices in our system. I want to see whether or not they're going to put in LED lighting to reduce the overall cost of the government. And Mr. Speaker, the degree to which they don't do that, I have to speak.
That's why we are Einstein, my friend.
I have to speak.
Yes.
So, Mr. Speaker, I supported that. I supported it with a caveat. And in this budget, we're looking to raise $522 million in VAT and other fees. I think some $480 million will be VAT. Mr. Speaker, on the issue of capital punishment, Marco City fully supports it and want to see it implemented. Bamboo Town fully supports it. I said it outside this place and I said it in here. Everything I can do to see that happen, I want to see it happen. As a matter of fact, I believe as does Tall Pines. That issue to me is so fundamental. Tall Pines said that may decide who you vote for in the next general elections. That's how fundamental that issue is to me. But I believe in putting in the safeguards in the system to ensure that the person has a fair trial. But when you have the mayhem taking place on our streets, you've got to find a way to get these young men to understand that life is sacred.
Yes.
And then when you take that infinite value and you've taken it away, then an infinite value must be paid for it.
I agree, totally.
There's no debating that.
Yes.
To me, it has to happen. Now, to be honest with you, I don't know where Fort Charlotte is on that. I know me and Fort Charlotte outside this place, we used to march together for it. So I assume he believes as such. But he can speak on that for himself, as he often does. Mr. Speaker, on the gaming bill. On the gaming bill, Mr. Speaker, I said, along with the member for St. Anne's, we were the first two in this parliament. St. Anne's said he ain't support no gaming bill if it discriminates against the Bahamian people. I got up immediately after him, and I said, I share his view. If we are going to go against the vote that took place for the Bahamian people, then you would have to give me, not that it matters, but you will have to give me the right, not only to give them a license, but to give the Bahamian people an opportunity to go anywhere in this country and gamble if they want. That's the only way I was going to support that. Marco City said the same thing. Fort Charlotte said the same thing. My party came, gave us half of that. We can license the fellas. But Bahamians ain't going in no casino. So I said, well, I can't support that. Marco City voted for it, because it gave him half of what he wanted. Fort Charlotte voted against it. I chose to abstain. I was deputy whip of the House. I absent myself. And some people were out there in the bogus fair. What a coward move. But you know, Mr. Speaker, I'd already said what my position was. And from that, Mr. Speaker, I see in this bill, we collected $30 million last year. We're looking to collect $50 this year. In gaming, taxes. On the select committee vote that took place in this place. Mr. Speaker, I am one who firmly believes that when there's the potential for danger to the Bahamian people in any sense of the word or any which way, we have a responsibility to give the information immediately. Immediately. Not yesterday. Immediately. I believe in that, Mr. Speaker. And so, I and Fort Charlotte, we did something in here. And many of my colleagues start feeling some kind of way. I can understand that. So immediately after that, Mr. Speaker, I started getting a lot of phone calls. Coming back to that phone call. On the gender equality bills. I said, Bamboo Town said, I support bills 1, 2, and 3. I can't support 4. I said it in here. I said it outside of here. I said if the government wants my support, if my party wants my support, this is what it ought to do. Fix 4. I said, then you can get my support. Marco City said, I support bills 1 and 3. I don't support 2 and 4. For Charlotte said, I support 1 and 3. I don't support 2 and 4. And let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, if my party had brought that bill without having made changes, then I would have stood in here and voted against it. And taken the consequences come with me. But Mr. Speaker, I want to talk about that phone call in a subsequent meeting. And the fellow said to me, Greg trying to carry on like a bulldog in this party and in that parliament. Andre acting like he's some pit bull. And you was a wannabe Rockwilder.
What?
All of y'all,
Who said that?
all of y'all, kind of like dogs, but you all in the pot cake. The pot cake has served his time and paid his dues. He could do that. Mr. Speaker, I can say what he said with you.
Go ahead.
But Mr. Speaker, I want it to be said in here
Go ahead.
that my fate, because the gentleman then came and said, you know, meetings have happened and you ain't getting no nomination. And I see the stuff in the press. Mr. Speaker, let me say it for the record. Mr. Speaker, my fate, my FATE, is not in the hands of any man. My or group of men and women, my FATE is in the hand of God, Mr. Speaker, in whom I put my FAITH, my faith. Because you see, Mr. Speaker, the Bible says with faith, you could say to that mountain, to that man, be thou removed and cast into the sea, and it will be done. Mr. Speaker, I walk by faith, not by sight. And the scripture says, Mr. Speaker, that many are the plans of a man's heart, but it's the Lord's purpose that prevails. So my fate is in his hands.
Sounded good, my boy.
And Mr. Speaker, anyone who looks at the life of Renward Ricardo Wells, son of William Renward Wells of Deadman's-Key, Long Island, and Leoma Frederica Flowers of Drake Hill, South Andros, would say, Mr. Speaker, would say of me, that but for the Lord, I stand in this place. It's because of him. There's the miracle of me.
You're part of my family.
Not because of no man.
Yes.
And Mr. Speaker, indeed, he has taken his holy hand and written the book of my life, as he's written the book of all of our lives. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, the psalmist said that, behold, I come in the volume of the book to do his will. And the psalmist spoke about Jesus, but he was talking about himself. David, who became the greatest king that the world has ever known. And Mr. Speaker, I believe that if all of us in here would live out that book written by the holy hand of God. And Mr. Speaker, I am not a perfect man. I have my faults and my foibles. But the one thing I do not want is for the Lord of life to write on the wall of my life with his holy hand, you've been weighed in the balance and found wanting, Mr. Speaker. So I live my life in some kind of way.
Yes.
And the mistakes I made, Mr. Speaker, I get up and ask for forgiveness and move on. But I want it to be known, Mr. Speaker, that if all of us in here would begin to follow the dictates, Mr. Speaker, that one day in this country, Mr. Speaker, one day in this parliament, in the economy of this country, in the educational system of this country, Mr. Speaker, in food security and energy security, Mr. Speaker, one day, as the prophet Isaiah said, every mountain will be made low, every valley exalted, the crooked places will be made straight, Mr. Speaker, and the rough places will be made smooth. The glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh, Mr. Speaker, will see it together, because the mouth of the Lord has spoken it, Mr. Speaker, and I know I will see it in this life. And if I don't see it in this life, I'll see it in the next when I rise in glory. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I will take this seat given to me by Almighty God.